It's a very difficult thing to be grieving the loss of a baby when people can't see that, right? When people can't see your motherhood, when they can't, they don't recognize that your baby was here.
Welcome to Beyond the Loss, a podcast from the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center. Here, we talk about what life looks like after loss, the quiet moments, the unexpected feelings, the ways people find community, and what life looks like in the days, months, and years to come. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to honor the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who have walked this land today and those who have gone before us. I'm your host, Candace Stevenson. Today's guest is Soraya Lakhani. Soraya first shared her story of loss with our community in 2022. She's here today to talk about the path she's been walking since then and how her journey has evolved. Thank you for being here today, Soraya.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell us about your initial connection to pregnancy and infant loss?
I was pregnant with our first child in 2021. And he was due February 2022. And it was my first pregnancy, so I didn't really have a lot of understanding of what to expect. But at the same time, I, had done a lot of research, and it was strange. I always had the sense that something was kind of off, or I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the early days of the pregnancy were very routine, very uneventful. And then in, I guess it would have been September of 2021, we went for our anatomy scan around the 20-week mark. And that was when they identified that our baby had an anomaly in his brain. And after that just kind of set off a cascade of appointments, scans, conversations with different types of physicians, with geneticists, trying to better understand what was happening. And ultimately, we made the decision to end the pregnancy. And so our son, Amaanat, was delivered at 22 weeks. On October 14th, 2021, which is just the day before Pregnancy and Infant Loss Remembrance Day, which is the 15th of October. And so after that, as we kind of began exploring different supports that were available, we came across the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center. Since then, we have gone on to have a living child as well. Our son, Sufyan, was born in January of 2023. So we've also had conversations with him about his brother. And so that's kind of been another layer of exploring how our loss has kind of shaped our family. Grief feels gentler in some ways, in many ways. But then there are still times when it kind of takes your breath away a little bit. I remember a couple of years ago, we were at a Christmas market, and there was this artist who was doing family portraits. And so we asked her to do one. And my husband said, maybe there's a way that we can incorporate Amaanat into the portrait. And so she did this beautiful, painting, and I'm kind of, it's me and my husband and our son, and then I'm holding a flower that represents Amaanat. And so we had her do this, and then she took a couple of hours to do it. So we were killing time at this market. And then when it was time to pick it up, my husband and son were in the car, and I just ran back in my coat, to grab this picture. And the artist was really lovely. And she was thank you so much for telling me your story. And, that must have been really hard. And it wasn't the first time someone has said that. But for whatever reason, in the middle of this very busy, chaotic Christmas market, with my husband and son in the car, I just, started crying. And, she was so lovely, and she gave me a hug. And it was just a very powerful reminder, I think, that grief is always there. It's not, a tunnel that you move through. It just simply is something you carry always. And often it's gentle and sometimes it demands to be felt. And that's okay, right? Like that's just a powerful reminder that that loss happened and it was heavy and it was hard and my baby's still not here.
It's interesting how grief just ebbs and flows in our life, and you don't always know. Like that morning when you were preparing to go to that market, you didn't know that that was the day that there would be a reminder. But they just sort of show up sometimes without us expecting. In those early days, as you found out about the center, what supports were the most grounding for you?
So PILSC is one of the few places that we came across that actually offers support specifically for terminations for medical reasons, which are a very stigmatized form of pregnancy loss. And it can be really hard to find spaces where support is offered specifically for that type of loss. So that was incredible, right? To find a place that offers that support, that names it. And the biggest supports that I accessed were these support groups that they have. So at that time, they offered like a drop-in support group for TFMR loss. And then they also offered like a closed 6-week group. So it was weekly for 2 hours. And it was the same community of people who would come together, and it was for 6 weeks, and it was all remote. But that was huge. That was a really huge support. I think one of the things I realized early on, because when we lost Amaanat, we had no living children, and we, through our journey with Amaanat, bringing him into the world, we had become parents, but I also recognized that not many people would see me as a mother. And so it's a very difficult thing to be grieving the loss of a baby when people can't see that, right? When people can't see your motherhood, when they can't, they don't recognize that your baby was here. And that was, I think, one of the most powerful things that I got from those PILSC support groups. Just being seen as a mother amongst other mothers, and all of us learning to try and, continue to parent our babies who are not here. To be seen kind of in our entirety like that was really powerful. And also to be amongst people who didn't just think of our babies in terms of absence, but also in terms of presence, right? Like we would name each other's babies, like as in we would say their names. We would light candles for them. We would talk about them, not just in terms of what was gone, but also when they were here. And that's something that is really hard to find, and a really tremendous, I think, healing gift.
So how would you say that having access to those supports shaped your journey?
I think it was huge. Like our stories make up who we are. And when you go through something so profound, and you don't have a space to tell that story, to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel validated and understood. That's a huge part of who you are, that you have nowhere to go. So having supports that were readily accessible, having a space where I could talk about these things openly amongst others, and there was this sense of community, right? I think that's what all of us are always searching for in different spheres of our life. Like community is how we survive. And so finding that around a type of loss that can be so isolating and so stigmatizing, but being brought into a space of warmth and into a space of connection was tremendous in terms of healing and learning how to, parent my son who is gone in all of those pieces.
Would you say that there are any specific conversations or moments or even people that really stayed with you coming out of those groups?
That 6-week group that I mentioned, there were 8 of us in it. And after the 6 weeks had passed, we carried on, like we had our own, WhatsApp group, and we would schedule calls, and it continued to be a community of support. And there were specific conversations we had. I remember one mom talking about how with medical terminations, like she thought of it as palliating her baby with her body, which was a really powerful way of conceptualizing, a medical termination. I remember one mom who had never named her baby, and it was just the idea of that was too painful. And then, over the months of all of us being connected, eventually she did name her baby, and she talked about her heart just like racing whenever she heard her husband use her baby's name, whenever she used her baby's name. I remember being connected outside of PILSC with another couple who were going through a medical termination. And I shared that with kind of this community that I built, and they just sent me like a flood of messages and pictures of candles lit and pieces of advice and just messages of care for me to share with this other couple. So all of those things were really powerful and beautiful. And that group of us, we stayed connected for a long time. Grief sometimes just comes at some moment and wants to be felt. And I think similarly in that group, sometimes there's just these little powerful reminders that, that this happened, and that we continue to be lost parents always.
You talked about how the journeys have unfolded in different ways, which I think is important for our listeners to hear, because there is no one set path after. You talked about having another son since. Can you tell me a little bit about what it is like growing that family after a loss?
I feel like when you lose a baby, especially because Amaanat was my first pregnancy, in some ways I accepted that I probably would never know like a purely joyful, stress-free pregnancy. I mean, I don't know if anyone entirely does, but I knew that, subsequent pregnancies would probably be somewhat anxiety provoking. But our son is here now. He's, it's wonderful. But I also think a lot of our conversations around Amaanat and how we process our loss, and how we continue to parent Amaanat also exist alongside how we bring Sufi into that conversation. He is only 3, but we have always talked to him about his brother and that his brother died. And there's little rituals that we have. So we go to the cemetery and there's a headstone for Amaanat. And so the first couple of times we did that, Sufi had like his little snack cup of goldfish. And so he would like put some on Amaanat's headstone. And it was, it was like they were just hanging out. He was trying to connect with his brother. But like now the situation's escalated to where he has like a bag of goldfish and then he just goes to like all the headstones and puts goldfish everywhere. It's really sweet kind of seeing him, just try to understand what it means to have a sibling who's not here. And it's interesting how, again, as with grief, like kids really catch you off guard. So we were at an activity a few months ago, and I was talking to a couple of the other moms, and one of them asked if Sufi's an only child. And, I think for any of us who have gone through loss, like that can be a loaded question. But in that moment, it wasn't really like, it was just I was just like, no, or I said, yes, he's an only child. Because it just, wasn't a conversation I was looking to have in that moment. And Sufi was just like sitting beside me. And when I turned my focus back to him, he said, no, Mama, I have brother Amaanat, but he died. And I was like, oh yeah, and it was it was a really, I think, powerful moment for me because I realized that the loss of Amaanat is not just mine or my husband's or ours as a couple, but it's also Sufi's. And the life of his brother and the loss of his brother will always also be part of Sufi's story and shape, who he is and shape what our family is.
We all kind of grow up with these ideas of what a family should look like. How have your thoughts around that changed as you've gone through this journey?
I grew up in a family with, it was my parents, it was me and my older sister. I was like, okay, that's the family of four. And that was kind of always what I thought I would do as well. And so when Sufi was around 2.5, I was like, okay, we should, start thinking of having another baby. Now, my husband grew up as an only child. And so he was always very open that, he's like, I feel very fulfilled as a parent of one. But if this is, part of our journey, then that's cool too. And so we did try to have, another child. And then we had a couple more losses. So we had a very early loss. It was kind of like a what we call a chemical pregnancy. And then another loss that was very drawn out and ultimately they determined was a pregnancy of unknown location. And so that took quite some time to resolve. But what was really interesting was going through those last two losses. I felt very differently to how I did when I lost Amaanat. And what I really started doing during that window was like hitting pause and starting to examine what for me had been kind of an unexamined choice. The idea of like having multiple children was just always like, this is what we're going to do. And when we were going through those losses, I had to wait. There was nothing else I could do. I had to wait for, the pregnancies to pass and to go see my doctor and all of those things. And I felt like I finally gave myself time to really think about what I wanted, separate from what I'd always thought things would look like and separate from what everyone else's family growth journey looked like, but just what I wanted and what, me and my husband wanted together. Ultimately, we made the decision that we are finished growing our family. But I feel more than grief, really, when I think of those last two losses. I feel a sense of gratitude that I was able to take that time and really slow down and think about what I want life to look like and what we as a family want our life to look like.
You talked about parenting, and I'm wondering if you feel that there's any part of your parenting that has shifted your relationship with grief, or what that looked like maybe along the way.
One of the things that I often come back to and say to myself is, it had to be this way for it to be this way. And when you have a living child after loss, you recognize that in many ways your living child is here. That specific living child is here because of your loss, and because of the timelines and how everything happened. And, for that exact child to be here at this exact time. And so it had to be this way for it to be this way. I think when you have a living child after loss, there's a greater recognition of everything that you lost, right? And there's kind of this parallel thing. And I still feel that, like, I have friends who have children who are like similar in age to the age Amaanat would have been. And so there's always this kind of parallel life that you sort of think about, and you become aware of everything you did not get to experience with the baby that you lost. But you also feel grateful I feel grateful for what I do get to experience with Sufi, and I feel grateful that he's here. And I recognize the intricate ways in which his existence here has been shaped by his brother's absence.
So what does remembering and honoring Amaanat look like in your life now?
One of the ways that we have tried to parent and honor Amaanat is by sharing his story. And whether that's in a forum like this, I think organizations like PILSC do a really great job of continuing to give us space to do that, right? I mean, with the walk that they have had, galas and teas in the past. I remember a couple of years ago going to one of their galas with my parents. And my parents bought a painting of this woman, and there's butterflies all around her. And they have that painting, and it hangs, in their living room. And it's very beautiful. It's just this beautiful piece of art and piece of remembrance that's always there. But I think it's also just giving yourself the grace and permission to do what feels right, right? There is no singular way of, of honoring a baby who's gone, whether, it's just, we just kind of do what feels right. Sometimes it's just conversations. It's going to the cemetery. It's going to the walk. We have a box of keepsakes that we were given from the hospital, the little onesie that he wore and the blanket, the little hospital bands. We got photographs taken. So we have all of those tokens too. They sit on our bookshelf. We don't look at them often, but they are there. They continue, and they will always have like a space in our home and in our family story.
If someone is listening to this and in the early days of their loss, what would you want to say to them?
I remember sending one of my best friends a message. He and I grew up together. He lives in Calgary now as well. And I just sent him a message to let him know what was going on. And I didn't hear anything from him for a few minutes. And then, I don't know, like maybe 15 minutes later, my doorbell rang and he was there. And this part always makes me cry. But at the time, I was trying to figure out like how to end the pregnancy. Because with a medical termination, we were given the option of a surgical termination or of an induction and kind of ultimately a stillbirth delivery. And my husband was very much like, this is your choice. I will support you, whatever you choose. And I remember trying to figure out what I needed to do for myself in that moment. But I was also like, I don't want to have regrets about how I go about doing this. When I look back on this 5 months or 5 years or 10 years from now, I don't want to regret the way in which I ultimately ended this pregnancy. And one of my friends once said, she's like, tragedy is very logistically heavy, but you have to you're making a lot of really hard decisions when you're already in a very, just like a very devastated headspace. So my friend came to my door and I was telling him this. And he just said, like, I hope that whatever you choose, I hope that whenever you look back on yourself in this moment, you will look back on yourself with compassion and you will know that you did the best that you could have done. And I think that is what I hope any couple, any person going through this, walking a journey similar to this, holds on to, is just giving themselves grace, giving themselves compassion, and surrounding themselves with people who give them that grace and compassion.
What would you say to somebody who is thinking of supporting PILSC but might not have had their own personal connection?
Pregnancy loss is incredibly common. And in all likelihood, people probably do have a connection to pregnancy loss, whether they know it or not, whether it's happened to them or somebody that they love or somebody that they work with. When Amaanat died, we shared our story very openly. And that was important to me because, we had changed as a family. And it was important to acknowledge that, to acknowledge his life. And And there were so many people who reached out and talked about losses that they had gone through, or losses that people that they loved or people that they knew had gone through. And their stories, they weren't sharing them in a way to say, this happens and, good luck, you just move on, all the best. They were sharing it from a place of genuinely wanting to talk about the losses that they had been through, talking about the babies that weren't here, talking about how these losses had transformed them and transformed the shape of their family, and just wanting to share in a space where they felt seen and they felt heard and they felt understood. I think, as I said, we're all always searching for community, and pregnancy and infant loss can be so isolating. It can be so painful and confusing. And places like PILSC offer warmth, they offer support, they offer community, which can be just the entire difference maker when it comes to somebody's journey. The other thing I will say about PILSC is that they do have supports to meet people in crisis, but I think it's also an organization that recognizes that there's parts of who we are that transcend crisis. I will always be a lost parent. That was true the day after I lost my son. It's true today, even when my grief feels gentler, and it will be true until the day that I die. I will always be a lost parent, and I will always be trying to remain connected to my child who isn't here. And I really value that organizations like PILSC are able to provide crisis support, but they also provide just ongoing community that sees you in the entirety of who you are and honors these pieces of who you are that will always be true, whether you are in immense pain, whether you have found an easier balance with your grief, wherever you are in your journey. Places like PILSC see you and they honor you in the fullness of who you are and your story, and the recognition of your babies who aren't here.
Thank you for being our guest today, Soraya. We really appreciate your time. And thank you for listening to Beyond the Loss. If today's conversation has touched you, or if you or someone you love is seeking support, the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Center offers free counseling, coaching, groups, and programs. These programs are made possible by donors and supporters. You can learn more at pilsc.org. Until next time, this is Beyond the Loss.